Hi, everybody. This week we continue our examination of Islamic art. So, as you recall, last week we were looking at sacred space of Islam, from the Dome of the Rock to various different plans of mosques. We're going to pivot this week to look at smaller objects, specifically portable objects, as well as some elements from mosques. So, I bring back this map to remind you how quickly Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula, pictured here in the orange and that kind of mustard color, how it spread from there eastward into Persia and as far as Afghanistan, and then westward towards along the Mediterranean into North Africa and eventually the Iberian Peninsula, what we know as Spain. So, first off, we're going to start in what is today Iraq. And we're going to start by looking at perhaps the most essential example of portable art in Islam, a page from the Qur'an. So this, like the page from Rebecca at the Well that we looked at under the Byzantine Empire, we are looking at something that is essentially the same kind of raw material. It's parchment or vellum, which is made of the skins of baby animals, calves, or baby goats, and ink. And unlike, though, that example we saw in the Byzantine Empire, this one has no illustration of the text. It is just text. And that fact alone is very, very important when we begin thinking about how Islam differs from Christianity. So first off, both traditions have the notion of a holy book. In the case of the Quran, however, the belief is that that is divine revelation, that the Quran is God revealing the truth to the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran is in Arabic, considered the holy language. And it means recitation, because that is, in fact, what the angel Gabriel said to Muhammad in the cave, is recite. And it's important to note that because, remember, Islam comes out of this nomadic desert culture in which the oral tradition was paramount. And so for the very earliest years of Islam, there were no printed, handwritten books of, what God said to Muhammad via Gabriel. It was just passed along orally from person to person, believer to believer. And it was only after the prophet's death that we have these written Qurans. So back to the page. So yes, what we're not going to see is an illustration of the text. We are just going to have text. The text is indeed in Arabic, and Arabic is read from right to left. And the interesting thing about Arabic is that there are letter forms that are very, very similar one to the other. And so how you distinguish one, and in this case I'm talking about consonant from another, is the inclusion of those little lines that are indicated with these light blue arrows. Additionally, vowels are designated by this kind of vocabulary of letters that, depending on how many little lines are consonants, or if there's the inclusion of a red circle that incorporates a vowel in that series of letters. So I want to make another kind of distinction here, because sometimes students get confused. So this page is obviously a passage from the Quran, but the creation of the letters is not something done hastily in order to just get the information out to the reader, but rather the creation of the letters are themselves an act of art that would have been very consciously in the minds of the people creating the letter forms. And so when we're talking about letter forms that are done with a kind of artful mindset. We call that calligraphy. So my guess is you're familiar with calligraphy because, you can buy special pens for calligraphy. You can learn about it. If you know somebody getting married, you can't just have an addressed letter. You ought to get it done, in calligraphy, an addressed invitation. So within calligraphy, in Arabic, though, there is a specific kind, and it's called Kufic. And it's really a family of calligraphic styles in Arabic, kind of like we have cursive, for example. But Kufic is characterized by this very strong kind of perpendicular up and down, and the letters one character can have an upright element, and then a very, very wide, very strong horizontal element. And it can become incredibly modular as well in this rendering of Kufic. So not only is the approach to letter making incredibly important, it itself is seen as a sacred act. And just as saying the word of God is a sacred act, beholding the word of God is a sacred act, so too is making each and every one of these letters. So much so that the placement of letters on the page is done in very careful geometric sort of calculations. So when we come back to this, we have the actual Quranic verse in that dark lettering with the red circles. And then that large, much wider band is sort of the title of the particular verse itself, incorporating and framing a kind of calligraphic title. So the placement of the Quranic verse, its title in that gold band, and then the space of the page itself, all of that kind of factors into an overall visual impact. So I want to make this distinction because when we were looking at that page of Rebecca at the well, the language is in Greek, and the focus was far more on getting that illustration of Rebecca. You remember she's walking out of her little city and she's getting the water and offering it to Eliezer. But here it is as much the text itself as the focus and the placement of the text. And as I mentioned already, the notion that the space around the letters was as much in the minds of the scribe as the letters themselves, so that the overall impact of the text on the page was such that everything looked proportional and pleasing to the eye of the person beholding it. The last thing I would want to say about these Quran pages, that of which the letters, there's not a lot of text and thus the letters are quite large, is that it was intended to be used within a mosque and shared among believers, so that if somebody is holding the book, people on either side of that person can see the text well enough to be reciting together the particular, or just reading the particular passage. Okay, so now we're going to move from what was Iraq to present day Afghanistan and beyond. And here I want to talk a little bit about the Silk Road, because we're going to focus our attention on Samarkand. And the thing about Samarkand is, and I do love this map I'm showing you right now, it was a major city on the series of routes which became later known collectively as the Silk Road. And these are trading routes that connected China with essentially Europe via, obviously, Asia Minor and the Middle East. And this map, a little small as it is, begins to help us understand, for example, how silk as a specifically Chinese product would eventually make itself into other parts of Asia and ultimately Europe. how glassware, and then of course how animals like horses and lap dogs, as you can read up there next to the red arrow. And what this map, of course, is also indicating is ideas. And um, in addition to these objects designated here, Buddhism found its way from India into China and ultimately into Japan via the Silk Road. Ideas from Europe made their way into India and then further into China via the Silk Road. And so it's not merely trade products, but it's people and it's ideas that also traveled along there. So, with this context in mind, I want to show us this dish. This is a fairly large plate produced originally in Samarkand and located along the Silk Road. And the plate itself, as you can see, has along its border that Kufic again. So remember, Kufic is just a style of writing Arabic. In this case, the Arabic is not from the Qur'an, but it is a kind of little epigram or a little kind of sentence or group of sentences that have to do with, um, equating eating well with wisdom. And so the design of this plate with that very careful and very artful use of Arabic would suggest a Muslim client, or ultimately the owner of this being a Muslim. But interestingly, the making of the plate, which is an earthenware plate, and that just indicates the temperature of the kiln that the clay was put in. But the important thing here is to note that the kind of glaze used here, that very white, the result is a very white piece of ceramic with a fairly minimal treatment of a darker glaze, indicates influence from China. So Samarkand is this perfect kind of intersection of craft skills from China intersecting with the interests of consumers of most likely Muslim, and how these two things can come together via the Silk Road. So here is a slide just kind of summarizing all of the ways that the Silk Road actually brought Europe and Asia together, made these boundaries that on a map look sort of permanent. The Silk Road and trade in general made those boundaries far more permeable. So here is another way of thinking about that in very visual terms. So on the right is an example of Chinese earthenware from the Tang Dynasty, a lidded container. And you see that interest in a fairly minimal approach at this point in Chinese art to the ceramic form, to the level of ornament on the ceramic, and that, again, that kind of creamy color. And then our plate on the left, which itself is approximates more the color of the object on the right. It's just this photo being what it is. Can't tell. So to summarize these couple of objects, first of all, what is clear here is the primacy given to language as an ornamental form. I already alluded to this last week when we were looking at the decoration of those sacred spaces. So calligraphy is a kind of fundamental way that Islamic art expresses itself. It's not going to resort terribly often to the human form. It does occasionally to the human form and the animal form, but the fact is the word and the artful creation of the word through calligraphy becomes itself just a kind of way of creating something beautiful as an end to itself. So, as we move into other examples of Islamic art, I want to remind you that calligraphy, along with geometry, along with what are termed arabesques, that floral and vine motifs, we're going to see those again and again in future objects. So stay tuned. Bye bye.